Over the course of history, endless amount of incredible moments have been captured in photographs for us to look back, relive, remember and learn from past mistakes. Here is a selection of some photographs that say more than words could ever express. Keith Sapsford from Sydney, Australia was just 14 years old in 1970 when he decided to leave the country after being fed up with his Catholic boarding school. Taking matters into his own hands, he snuck onto the tarmac at Sydney Airport and climbed into an airplane's wheel compartment to hitch a ride to Japan. Unfortunately, it was the last decision he ever made. Although he was sure that he would avoid the dangers of high altitude exposure by staying inside the plane's wheel well, he was unaware that the compartment would reopen when the plane's wheels retracted. Shortly after liftoff, he fell about 200 feet to his death. Amateur photographer John Gilpin, who was taking pictures of planes at the airport, by pure coincidence snapped this image that captured Sapsford in mid-air moments before his death. Soviet scientist and doctor Vladimir Demikov was a brilliant man who pioneered the science of organ transplantation. But he was also obsessed with the notion of transplanting a dog's head onto another dog. He tried to graft the head of a living dog onto the body of another living dog, resulting in a two-headed dog at least 24 times. In this photo, we see Demikov's most famous two-headed dog, where a smaller dog's body was amputated and then grafted onto a German shepherd's back. This experiment from 1959 became famous because it was publicized outside the Soviet Union with the photographs that ran in Life magazine. This dog lived just 4 days, which was a far cry from Demikov's most successful abomination, a two-headed dog that lived for 29 days after surgery. In 1967, women's sports were eyed with suspicion. While there were female Olympians and professional tennis players, the notion that a woman could or would want to do something such as run a marathon was dismissed out of hand. Though women had participated in the Boston Marathon, they had only done so unofficially, never as registered competitors. Under the rules, official entrants had to be men. Catherine Schweitzer changed that when she registered as KV Schweitzer and ran the race. When race officials found out, the race manager Jock Semple tried to rip the numbers off of her sweatshirt because according to rules, only men could run as registered number-winning competitors. After the incident, she went on to not only finish the race but also became a leading advocate for women's sports as well. Although this photo may look like it shows a Hannibal Lecter convention, it's actually a beauty pageant. The women seen here are competing for the title of Miss Lovely Eyes in 1930 in Florida. The contest was about the loveliness of the eyes and only the eyes, so the contestants wore these odd masks that covered their mouth, cheeks, jawline and forehead. On April 13, 1945, near Magdeburg, Germany, American soldiers came upon a train full of civilians. The German soldiers tasked with guarding the train had fled, and the women, children, and few old men emerging confused were the former prisoners from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. An American soldier snapped this picture of people who had been through hell and were learning at that very moment that the tide of the war had turned and that they were going to survive. In the late 19th century, a graveyard in Roermond, Netherlands was strictly divided into Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish areas, and it was strictly forbidden for anyone to be buried in a section that did not match their faith. In 1842, a young Dutch Catholic noblewoman married a Protestant man who was an officer in the Dutch cavalry. The woman was destined to be buried with her family in the Catholic section of the cemetery, but her husband would not be allowed in the family plot. So she came up with a solution, ordering 2 extra tall grave markers, one with a male hand protruding and another with a female hand. When her husband died in 1880, he was buried in the Protestant section beside the wall, and when she died 8 years later, she was buried just on the other side of the wall in the Catholic section. Their eternally locked hands have since become a symbol of love overcoming religious division. Princess Diana and Prince Charles' 1983 Australian tour proved to be an inflection point in their young marriage. It was during that 6-week visit to Australia and New Zealand when Charles first realized how much the public preferred his pretty young wife to him, and Diana in turn realized There was nothing she could do to temper her husband's jealousy or convince him she didn't want the spotlight. While the princess's popularity was clearly on display, so were her problems with it at times. This photo captures the exact moment the young princess erupted into tears in front of an admiring crowd during a public appearance outside the Sydney Opera House. On January 28, 1986, the vaunted United States space program suffered its greatest tragedy when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded moments after launch. All 7 crew members died. This photo shows the doomed crew of the Space Shuttle all smiles on the morning of their fatal launch. Few creatures are as fear-inspiring as the xenomorph from the 1979 sci-fi horror film Alien. The space predator was portrayed by Nigerian art student Bolaji Badezo, who was 6 foot 10 inches tall with remarkably long legs. It was the long legs that made his portrayal of the alien so convincing, as the creature's proportions seemed to be significantly different from that of a human. Badezo didn't appear in the sequels to Alien, and in fact he never acted in another film. He returned to Nigeria, where he opened an art gallery in 1983 and died in 1992 of sickle cell anemia. A hangover is tough on the brain, and if you're suffering one, it's a good bet that your face looks worse for wear as well. In 1947, Maximilian Factorowicz, who would later be known as cosmetics king Max Factor, figured he could pull a woman's face back together by strapping a mask with couple dozen ice cubes across her flesh. The ice cubes were not ice but rather plastic shells that contained a cooling element. Still, this does not look remotely comfortable, nor does it look like something that would actually work. In 1957, 15-year-old Dorothy Counts was one of a small number of black students to apply and be accepted to attend Harry Harding High School in Charlotte, North Carolina for 4 days. The school was all white, and on her first day she was met by intense racism as hundreds of students tried to block her from entering the school, while others threw rocks at her or spit on her. She was harassed constantly, and any white students she spoke with drew criticism from the mob as well. While Count's expression in this photo demands sympathy, what's truly fascinating in the worst way is the looks on the faces of the white students behind her. So indoctrinated are they by tradition that they see this brave, barrier-breaking student as some sort of joke. This photo from June 13, 1936 shows a large gathering of workers at Blomquist shipyard in Hamburg, Germany for the launching of the Navy training ship Horst Wessel. Almost everyone in the image has raised their arm in the Nazi salute, except a man toward the back of the crowd who grimly stands with his arms crossed over his chest. That man has become a symbol of refusing to cave to herd mentality and has been identified as August Landmaster by his daughter. Landmaster, who had been a Nazi, was kicked out of the party when he became engaged to Irene Eckler, a Jewish woman. He continued his relationship with Eckler and consequently was sent to prison for the crime of dishonoring the race. While Landmaster certainly had good reasons to refuse the Nazi salute, some historians point out that the photos of Landmaster don't really resemble the man in the picture, and feel that it's actually a different employee, Gustav Wizard. Soldiers fighting in war have always suffered trauma caused by the hell around them. The fear of losing one's own life is harrowing, as is witnessing one's comrades shot or blown to bits by artillery. That artillery gave a name to the suffering of soldiers in war, shell shock. So while this soldier's condition would have been described as shell shock in 1916, today we recognize it with the serious designation of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. This photo from 1948 shows Mrs. Lucille Chalifoux of Chicago turning shamefully away from the camera as a sign announces that her 4 children are for sale. Her husband was an out-of-work coal truck driver, and they had decided that they could not afford to raise their children. So their decision was to sell them. Adding a further wrinkle to the tragic story, Lucille was pregnant at the time this photo was taken. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake stands as the deadliest natural disaster in California history and is among the deadliest in US history. Initial estimates of the death toll ranged from 375 to 500 plus, but the numbers were vastly undercounted and could be as high as 3,000 plus. As the quake affected the densely populated city including districts like Chinatown, getting an accurate count of the dead was simply not possible. Besides shaking the grounds which caused buildings to topple, the quake also left giant cracks in the earth where the ground split apart. These were visible throughout the region, even many miles north of the city of San Francisco. Myrtle Corbin was a dipygus, which means that the axis of her body split into two halfway down. She was born with two pelvises side by side and two pairs of legs. Her two inner legs were underdeveloped, and although she could move them, she could not use them to walk or stand. Her outer legs were fairly normal, except that she had a clubbed right foot which gave her an odd gait. Born in Tennessee in 1868, Corbin by the 1880s was an extremely popular sideshow attraction, billed as the four-legged girl from Texas. She had two separate sets of sexual organs and two uteruses and was capable of bearing children. She got married when she was 19 and had four daughters and a son. When Corbin died at the age of 59, her family buried her in a concrete encased coffin to prevent grave robbing.